The blood trail started at my back fence and ended at my door. In 15 years of veterinary practice, I'd seen animals come to me for help, but never like this. Never with such precision. As if she'd mapped the route in her mind, calculated each agonizing step through the desert darkness. It was 3 in the morning when the scratching woke me, not the frantic clawing of a trapped animal or the tentative pawing of a lost dog. This was deliberate, rhythmic, patient, the kind of sound that raises every hair on your arms because somewhere deep in your brain you know it means something. I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez. I run a small veterinary clinic attached to my home in southern New Mexico, where the high desert meets the mountains and wildlife outnumbers people 10 to 1. Over the years, I'd treated everything from ranchers' horses to someone's escaped emu. I'd seen coyotes from a distance, heard them singing in the arroyos at dusk, but I'd never had one come to my door. The scratching stopped as I approached. Through the window, I saw her. She was lying on the welcome mat, and that detail still haunts me, not collapsed beside it or near it, on it, as if she understood what welcome meant. Her coat was matted with dust and dried blood, her sides heaving with exhaustion, but it was her eyes that stopped my hand on the doorknob. They tracked my movement through the glass with perfect clarity, focused, aware, waiting. My legs buckled as I knelt beside the window. This couldn't be happening. Wild coyotes didn't approach human homes. They didn't wait patiently on porches. They didn't make eye contact like this, steady and unblinking, as if trying to communicate something words couldn't carry. I grabbed my medical bag and a heavy blanket, my heart hammering as I unlocked the door. The October air was cold and sharp, carrying the scent of creosote and something else, the copper tang of blood. The coyote didn't move as I stepped onto the porch, didn't growl or bare her teeth. She simply watched me with those impossible eyes. Then I saw the leg. Her right rear leg was nearly severed just above the hock. The wound was catastrophic, muscle and tendon exposed, bone visible beneath the torn flesh. This was the kind of injury you saw in leg-hold trap cases, the brutal mathematics of an animal chewing through its own limb to escape. Except she hadn't escaped. The leg was still attached by threads of tissue and sheer will. "Jesus," I whispered. The coyote's ears flicked at my voice, not back in warning, forward, listening. I spread the blanket on the porch and carefully, so carefully, slid it beneath her body. She allowed this. That's the only word for it. Allowed. Her muscles tensed, but she didn't struggle, didn't snap, didn't fight as I wrapped her and lifted. She weighed maybe 30 pounds, light for an adult female, and I could feel every rib through the blanket. How long had she been traveling like this? How many miles on this dying leg? The clinic door was 15 feet away. I'd left it unlocked, as I always did. The building was attached to my house, part of the same structure. My hands were shaking as I carried her inside, my mind already cataloguing what I'd need. Sedation, X-rays, probably amputation, possibly euthanasia. I laid her on the examination table under the bright lights. The blood trail on my porch gleamed wet and dark in the moonlight behind me, and I found myself turning back to look at it. The pattern was too straight, too purposeful. She hadn't wandered randomly into my yard. This was a route, a destination, but that was impossible, wasn't it? I turned back to the coyote. She was still watching me, her breathing labored but steady. I reached slowly for her head, expecting her to flinch, to snap. My hand touched the soft fur between her ears. She closed her eyes. In that moment, something shifted in my chest, a recognition I didn't have words for. This animal had made a choice. Somehow, impossibly, she had chosen me. Chosen this place, traveled through agony in the dead of night to reach this specific door. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the clinic door, to the X-ray room. This wasn't fear. It was the recognition that something impossible was happening. Something that would demand I question everything I thought I understood about the line between human and wild, between instinct and intention. I thought I knew what the X-ray would show. I'd seen trap injuries before, crushed bone, severed tendons, merciful endings. Animals came to me broken, and I helped them or I let them go. Clean, simple, understandable. But what appeared on that screen made me question everything I thought I understood about wildlife. Moving her into the X-ray room required a level of trust I'd never experienced with a wild animal. I supported her body, avoiding the ruined leg, and she remained absolutely still. Not frozen in terror, cooperative, as if she understood that this hurt less if she didn't fight. I positioned her on the table, angling for a lateral view of the injured leg. The machine hummed to life. She didn't flinch at the sound. Most dogs panicked at that hum. Most cats required sedation just to get them near the equipment. But this coyote, this wild creature who should have been biting and thrashing, simply lay there with her head resting on her paws. The first image materialized on the screen. I saw the new injury immediately. The hock joint was shattered, fragments of bones scattered like dropped china. The soft tissue damage was even worse than I'd thought. This leg couldn't be saved. But that wasn't what made my breath catch in my throat. There, in the femur above the fresh fracture, were two parallel lines of metal, straight, deliberate, gleaming white against the grey of bone, surgical pins. I zoomed in, my fingers clumsy on the controls. The pins were positioned with perfect precision, running through what had clearly been an old fracture site. The bone around them showed complete healing, smooth remodeling, successful integration. This wasn't recent. These pins had been inside her for months, maybe longer. "No," I said aloud, to the empty room. "No, that's not possible." But the evidence was right there in black and white. I took another image from a different angle. Then another. The pins appeared in each one, undeniable. Steinmann pins, if I was reading the diameter correctly. Double trocar, threaded, the exact type I used for complex fractures in dogs, the kind used in professional veterinary orthopedic surgery. My mind raced through possibilities. Wildlife rehabilitation centers sometimes performed surgeries on injured animals before release, but they used wildlife veterinarians, documented every case, followed strict protocols, and they certainly didn't use hardware designed for domestic animals. The cost alone would be prohibitive for a wild coyote with no owner, no insurance, no guarantee of survival, unless someone was using her for something else. I pulled up the image on the larger diagnostic monitor, adjusting the brightness and contrast. The pins were pristine, no signs of infection, no bone rejection. Whoever had placed them knew exactly what they were doing. This was skilled surgical work, meticulous, the kind of precision that took years of training to develop, which somehow made it worse. I photographed the screen with my phone, my hands trembling. Then I did something I rarely did at 4 a.m. I called a colleague. Dr. Marcus Webb in Phoenix had worked with wildlife rehabilitation for 2 decades before moving into private practice. If anyone would have insights, it would be him. He answered on the 3rd ring, voice rough with sleep. "Elena, what's wrong?" "I need you to look at something," I said. "I'm sending you X-rays right now." I heard him moving, probably reaching for his laptop. 30 seconds of silence. Then, "What am I looking at?" "Adult female coyote came to my property 3 hours ago with a catastrophic leg injury. But look at the hardware." Another pause, longer this time. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had changed. "Those are Steinmann pins, pediatric gauge, unless I'm wrong." "You're not wrong. Eleanor, where did you get this animal?" She came to me, literally dragged herself to my back door. "That's not what I mean." His tone had gone flat. Professional. The voice he used when delivering bad news to clients. I've seen this before. There was a wildlife rehabilitation center. Colorado, maybe New Mexico. They were shut down 2 years ago. There were rumors. My stomach dropped. What kind of rumors? Experimental surgeries. They claimed they were developing new techniques for wildlife medicine, but people talked, said they were using injured animals as practice subjects, teaching surgical procedures on wildlife, then releasing them to see if the repairs would hold in the wild. The scientific literature I'd studied never mentioned this. Coyotes survived impossible injuries in the wild. Yes, broken legs, gunshot wounds, even losing entire limbs, but not with human hardware inside them, not carrying someone else's experiment in their bones. Marcus, how many animals? I don't know. The investigation was quiet, but Elena... He paused, and I heard him exhale slowly. Everyone assumed the animals died. No one expected them to survive long enough to matter. I looked through the window into the recovery room where the coyote lay watching me. Still calm, still waiting. This one survived, I said, quietly. Marcus stayed on the line while I took more x-rays. Full body series. I needed to see everything. The images revealed a story written in bone and metal, a map of survival that shouldn't have been possible. The surgical site in her femur was perhaps 8 months old, judging by the bone remodeling. But there were other injuries too. Old rib fractures, long healed, scar tissue in her right shoulder, worn teeth that suggested she was at least 4 years old, possibly 5. This coyote had lived a hard life even before someone cut her open and inserted foreign objects into her leg. I'm going to make some calls, Marcus said finally. There was a wildlife officer involved in the original investigation. Let me see if I can find out more. After he hung up, I stood in the dark clinic, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the medication room, the distant yip of coyotes in the hills. The same species as the animal on my table. But she was here, and they were out there, and somehow that divide felt more significant than it ever had before. I checked on her every 20 minutes through the pre-dawn hours. Each time she was awake, watching the door, waiting for me to return. At 6:30, as pink light began bleeding across the desert sky, my phone rang. Marcus. His voice was tight. I found the officer. Eleanor, sit down. I sat. The center was called Second Chance Wildlife Rehabilitation, based outside Albuquerque. They operated for 3 years before someone reported them. The founder was a veterinary student who'd flunked out of school twice. He convinced some donors he was pioneering new surgical techniques for wildlife conservation. But he wasn't. He was practicing, using injured wildlife as surgical training subjects. They'd take in animals that should have been euthanized, severe fractures, major trauma, perform complex surgeries, then release them with minimal follow-up to monitor survival rates in natural conditions. Marcus's tone made it clear what he thought of that justification. Everything inside me screamed impossible, but the evidence was there, metal and bone, captured in black and white on my screen. How many animals, Marcus? At least 40 that they documented. Coyotes, foxes, raccoons, anything they could get their hands on, the ones they tracked. He stopped. Started again. None of them survived more than 6 weeks after release. None? Not one. Most died within 2 weeks. Infections, hardware failure, predation while compromised. The investigation found remains of 12 animals. All had surgical implants. All dead. I looked through the window again. The coyote had shifted position slightly, favoring her injured side, but her eyes were still fixed on the door between us. Still waiting. There's more, Marcus said quietly. The officer started getting reports about 2 years ago. ranchers finding dead coyotes with metal inside them, wildlife officers finding bones with pins still attached. They tracked 6 confirmed cases in New Mexico alone over the past 18 months. 6 dead, carrying evidence in their bones that no one had been looking for until it was too late. Elena, if this animal came from that center, she's been surviving in the wild with that hardware for months, maybe close to a year. That shouldn't be possible. But she had. Against infection, against hardware failure, against every statistical probability. She had survived someone's experiment, lived through the failure rate, and kept going. Why did she come to me? I asked, though I wasn't sure I was asking Marcus anymore. Why here? Why now? I don't know, but Elena, you need to document everything, every X-ray, every measurement, every observation. This animal is evidence. She's proof of what was done. After we hung up, I went back into the recovery room. The coyote's ears swiveled toward me as I entered, her eyes tracking my approach. I knelt beside the kennel, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in her amber irises, close enough to smell the dust and sage in her coat. "You came to show me, didn't you?" I whispered. "You survived all of it. And you came to someone who would see." She didn't move, but something in her gaze shifted, not softening, sharpening, as if I'd finally understood the question she'd been asking since she appeared at my door. While I made those calls, the coyote lay in the recovery kennel watching me. I thought she was simply exhausted, but later, much later, I understood. She was waiting for me to see what had been done. By mid-morning, I had contacted the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish and sent them copies of every X-ray. The wildlife officer who called me back, a woman named Sarah Chen, sounded exhausted before she even introduced herself. "Dr. Vasquez, how confident are you about the age of those implants?" 6 to 8 months minimum based on bone remodeling. Could be longer. She was quiet for a moment. "We need to examine this animal. Can you keep her stable until we get there?" "I can try, but Officer Chen, her new injury is severe. The leg won't survive. I need to make a decision soon about treatment." "Do what you need to do, just document everything." After she hung up, I returned to the X-rays, studying them with fresh eyes. The new fracture bothered me. It wasn't a clean break from a trap or a vehicle strike. The bone had shattered at its weakest point, right at the edge of the old surgical site where the original pins ended. I measured the fracture pattern on screen, zooming in until I could see the individual bone fragments. The femur had healed well around the pins, but the surgery had altered the bone's natural stress distribution, created a weak point, a vulnerability that didn't exist before someone cut into her leg. The old surgery had saved her from one injury, only to doom her to another. I pulled up my mapping software and estimated distances. My property sat 15 miles from the nearest paved road, 23 miles from the closest town. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center Marcus mentioned had been outside Albuquerque, at least 40 miles northeast of here, through rough desert terrain. 40 miles. I stared at that number, tried to imagine traveling 40 miles on a shattered leg, on bone fragments grinding against each other with every step, through desert heat during the day, freezing nights in October, no food, limited water, pain that would make most animals simply lie down and die. My mind refused to believe what the measurements showed. 40 miles, on a leg that should have collapsed after 40 feet. But the evidence was there. The dust embedded deep in the wound suggested days of travel, the dehydration evident in her sunken eyes and dry gums, the muscle wasting that came from burning every reserve just to keep moving. She had dragged herself across wilderness, through agony, following some incomprehensible navigation to reach this specific place. to reach me. I checked on her again. She had finally fallen asleep, her breathing shallow but steady. Even unconscious, her body was positioned protectively, curled around the injured leg, keeping it still, conserving energy, surviving. The question I couldn't escape sat like a stone in my chest. Could I repair this? Should I? The surgical challenge itself wasn't the issue. I'd performed amputations before. The leg was unsalvageable, but a three-legged coyote could survive in the wild. Research showed they adapted, compensated, lived full lives. But this animal had already endured one surgery, already carried foreign objects in her body, already survived impossible odds. What did humane treatment mean when the original injury was caused by human intervention? When someone's experiment had created the weakness that led to this fracture? When every choice I made would be colored by what someone else had done to her first? I prepared the surgical suite, my hands moving through familiar routines while my mind spiraled, sterilizing instruments, laying out sutures, checking anesthesia levels. But I wasn't just preparing for surgery. I was making a choice that went beyond medicine. This wasn't about saving one coyote. It was about witnessing what had been done and documenting it. I returned to her, kennel with a syringe of sedative. She woke as I approached, eyes focusing on me immediately. No panic, no aggression, just that same steady gaze, as if she'd been waiting for this moment since she first scratched at my door. "I'm going to help you," I told her, though I knew she couldn't understand the words. "But I need you to know I see what was done, I see it, and I'm going to make sure others do too." I administered the sedative. As it took effect, her eyes stayed locked on mine. 5 seconds, 10, 15, until finally, slowly, her lids grew heavy and closed. My hands were shaking as I lifted her onto the surgical table. Not from nervousness about the procedure, from the weight of understanding that I was the witness she'd traveled 40 miles to find. The injured leg had to come off. There was no question about that. But first, I needed to remove the old pins from the femur, the ones that had turned her bone into a time bomb. I made the first incision through scar tissue that told its own story. The original surgery had been performed with precision, clean entry points, proper placement, textbook technique. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. The sutures had dissolved months ago, but the pattern was still visible in the healed skin. Small, even stitches, professional work. Which made it worse somehow. This wasn't butchery. This wasn't some amateur with a scalpel and delusions of competence. This was skill applied without ethics, knowledge used without wisdom. I exposed the first pin. It gleamed under the surgical lights, silver and sterile, despite months inside a wild animal's body. I checked for signs of infection, redness, pus, bone deterioration. Nothing. The tissue around the pin was healthy. The bone had integrated the foreign metal as if it belonged there. The surgery had worked. That was the cruelest part. It had actually worked. I carefully backed out the first pin, feeling the resistance as the threads released from bone. It came free, cleanly, no fragments, no complications. I placed it in a steel specimen tray where it made a small, definite clink. Evidence, testimony, written in titanium. The second pin followed. Same pristine condition, same successful integration. I found myself staring at them as they lay side by side in the tray. 2 pieces of medical-grade hardware that had kept a wild coyote's leg functional for the better part of a year. They'd done their job perfectly. And in doing so, they'd created the stress fracture that brought her to my door. The old pins gleamed under the surgical lights as I placed them in the steel tray. They looked like evidence, like testimony written in titanium. I moved to the amputation. This part I'd done before, calculated cuts through muscle, careful ligation of blood vessels, smooth bone ends that wouldn't cause pain later. The leg came away in my hands, and I set it aside for the wildlife officer to examine. More evidence, more proof. As I worked, I kept thinking about the person who'd performed the original surgery. They would have stood exactly where I was standing, used similar instruments, followed the same anatomical landmarks, but when they finished, they hadn't kept this animal for weeks of recovery, hadn't monitored for infection or hardware failure. They'd released her back into the wild to see what would happen, to see if she would live or die. She'd lived. Against their expectations, against the statistics Marcus had cited, against every other animal who'd carried similar hardware into the wilderness. She had survived. I closed the amputation site with careful sutures, layer by layer, muscle, subcutaneous tissue, skin, each stitch precise, each knot secure. When I finished, the surgical site looked clean and professional. The kind of work I was proud of, the kind that would heal well and give this animal a chance at continued survival. But I couldn't shake the thought, was I any different from the person who'd done the first surgery? I was also cutting into a wild animal, inserting my will into her body, deciding her fate based on my knowledge and my ethics. The only difference was my intention, my belief that I was helping rather than experimenting. Was that enough? I administered post-operative pain medication and antibiotics, then carefully transferred her back to the recovery kennel. She would wake in an hour or two. Wake to find her leg gone, replaced by sutures and empty space. Would she understand? Would she adapt? Would she survive this second intervention as impossibly as she'd survived the first? I cleaned the surgical suite in silence, my mind replaying every moment of the procedure. Standard work, textbook technique. Nothing remarkable except the patient herself and the metal fragments now sitting in a specimen jar on my desk. I repaired the new fracture, stabilized what remained, closed the incision. Standard procedure, but nothing about this was standard. As the Coyote came out of anesthesia, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to let her story disappear. Whatever happened next, whether she survived or didn't, whether she returned to the wild or not, someone needed to know what had been done. Someone needed to bear witness. I photographed the old pins from every angle, documented their measurements, their condition, their precise specifications, created a file that I would send to wildlife authorities, veterinary boards, anyone who would listen. This Coyote had carried evidence for months. Now I would carry it for her. She woke 3 hours later with the kind of quiet awareness I'd never seen in a post-surgical animal. No thrashing, no panic. Her eyes opened, focused on the ceiling, then swept the kennel methodically, taking inventory, assessing. When her gaze found me sitting in the chair across from her, she went completely still. I expected wild animal behavior, the frantic realization of captivity, the instinct to escape. Instead, she simply looked at me. 1 second, 2, 5. Then she laid her head back down on the blanket as if she'd confirmed something important, as if she'd checked that I was still there, still watching. Over the next 2 days, I discovered just how calculated her behavior was. She wouldn't eat unless I was present in the room, not hovering, not hand-feeding, just present. I could sit in my chair, work on my laptop, return phone calls. But if I left, she ignored the food. The moment I returned, she would eat. Slowly, deliberately, maintaining eye contact between bites. This wasn't domesticated behavior. It was something else, something more intentional. She was showing me she was eating, proving she was strong enough to survive, demonstrating that my intervention had worked. On the second day, Officer Chen arrived with a wildlife biologist named Dr. James Rodriguez. They examined the X-rays in silence, then asked to see the surgical site and the recovered pins. I showed them everything: my documentation, my measurements, my timeline reconstruction. Dr. Rodriguez photographed the pins from multiple angles, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Dr. Vasquez, we've been tracking cases like this for 18 months. Do you know how many animals we've found? Marcus mentioned 6. 6 dead animals, he corrected quietly. All carrying similar hardware. All deceased within 2 years of the rehabilitation center's closure. This is the first living specimen we've encountered. 6 others, 6 other animals carrying evidence in their bones. All dead. She was the only witness left. Officer Chen knelt beside the kennel, studying the coyote through the wire mesh. She's calm, remarkably calm for a wild animal in captivity. She's been like this since she arrived, cooperative, almost purposeful. Purposeful, Chen repeated, as if testing the word. She pulled out her phone and made a call, speaking in low tones I couldn't quite hear. When she returned, her expression was grim. Dr. Vasquez, we need to expand our investigation. If this animal survived this long with complications from the original surgery, there might be others. We need to know how widespread this was. Dr. Rodriguez was still examining the X-rays. The new fracture occurred at the exact point where the pins ended. Classic stress riser effect. The hardware created a weakness in the bone that eventually failed under normal load bearing. He shook his head slowly. Whoever performed the original surgery knew this was a risk. They would have known that releasing her meant potential long-term complications. They didn't care, I said flatly. No, they didn't. After they left with copies of all my documentation, I sat with the coyote in the dimming afternoon light. She watched me with those steady amber eyes, and I found myself talking to her as if she could understand. 6 others didn't make it, but you did. You survived. Their experiment? Survived the hardware failure, survived 40 miles on a shattered leg. Why? What made you different? She didn't answer, of course, but in that moment, species didn't matter. Something in me shifted that day. I understood we share more than just a planet. We share a capacity to remember what's been done to us. That evening, my phone rang. Officer Chen, her voice tight with controlled emotion. Dr. Vasquez, we found another one. Dead coyote, 15 miles from your location. Same hardware, same pin configuration. That makes 7 total. My heart dropped. When? Necropsy suggests 3 weeks ago. She'd been dead for a while before anyone found her. 7 animals, 7 living creatures used as practice subjects, released with metal in their bones, dying slowly in the wilderness with no one to witness their suffering. Except one. One had made it far enough to find help, to find documentation, to find someone who would see. The coyote shifted in her kennel, adjusting her weight to accommodate the missing leg. Even that movement was careful, measured. Nothing wasted, everything calculated for survival. She hadn't just come to me for healing. She'd come to testify, to prove that the 7 weren't nameless statistics, that what had been done to them mattered, that someone should have believed in them all along. Officer Chen and Dr. Rodriguez returned 3 days later with a recommendation I'd been dreading. Euthanasia, Chen said, though her voice carried no conviction. That's the standard protocol for a 3-legged wild animal with this kind of trauma history, too compromised for survival in the wild. I looked at the coyote in her kennel. She'd been standing on her remaining 3 legs that morning, testing her balance, learning her new center of gravity with the same methodical patience she applied to everything. When she saw me watching, she took 3 careful steps, then sat down, demonstrating, showing me she could manage. No, I said. Dr. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. Dr. Vasquez, I understand your attachment to this animal, but it's not attachment, it's evidence. I pulled up research on my laptop, studies of three-legged coyotes surviving in the wild, adapting their hunting strategies, living full lifespans. She already survived the impossible. She lived for months with hardware that killed 6 other animals. She traveled 40 miles on a destroyed leg. You're telling me she can't adapt to 3 legs when she's already proven she can adapt to anything? Chen and Rodriguez exchanged glances. Finally, Chen spoke. What are you proposing? Release her. With a tracking collar, monitor her for 3 months. If she shows signs of decline, I'll make the call myself, but she deserves the chance to prove what she can do. This is irregular, Rodriguez said, but he was already considering it. I could see the shift in his posture, the way his eyes moved back to the coyote. The data would be valuable. We've never had the opportunity to track a survivor from the rehabilitation center cases. It took 2 more days of paperwork and phone calls, but they agreed. On a cool October morning, I fitted the Coyote with a GPS tracking collar, lightweight, designed to fall off automatically after 6 months. She tolerated the procedure with her characteristic calm, those amber eyes watching my face the entire time. I drove her to the edge of wilderness, 15 miles from my property, far enough that if she returned, it would be choice, not confusion. Dr. Rodriguez accompanied me, his laptop already synced to receive data from her collar. I opened the kennel door and stepped back. She didn't bolt, didn't scramble for freedom the way I'd expected. Instead, she emerged slowly, carefully, testing her 3-legged balance on unfamiliar ground. The morning sun caught her coat, highlighting the silver guard hairs among the brown. She looked smaller somehow in the vastness of the desert landscape, fragile and fierce at once. Then she did something that stopped my breath in my chest. She approached me, directly, deliberately, walked right up until she was standing close enough to touch, her scarred shoulder level with my knee. And she looked up at me with those impossible eyes. 5 seconds passed, 10, 15. I counted them in my racing heartbeats. Her gaze held mine with an intensity that felt almost human. Recognition, acknowledgement, something I had no words to describe. Not gratitude exactly. Deeper than that. Older. My legs buckled slightly. I had to lock my knees to stay standing. This doesn't happen, I thought. This can't happen. Wild animals don't do this. They don't make eye contact like this. They don't stand in witness to their own release. Like they're marking the moment, memorizing it, understanding its significance. But she was doing exactly that. Dr. Rodriguez stood frozen beside his truck, phone out, recording. I heard his breathing stop, then restart unevenly. He felt it too, the weight of this moment, the impossibility of it. Then she turned, smoothly, without hesitation, and she walked into the scrub oak and creosote, a 3-legged gait already showing signs of adaptation. Within 30 seconds, she'd vanished into the landscape as if she'd never been there at all. I stood staring at the empty space where she'd disappeared, my heart hammering, my eyes burning with tears I didn't fully understand. In that moment, I'd witnessed something that defied every boundary I'd drawn between human and animal consciousness. She'd understood. Not just that I was releasing her, that I had seen her, documented her, borne witness to what had been done. And she'd acknowledged that witness. Then she turned and vanished into the scrub oak. I expected never to see her again, but nature had other lessons prepared. Recording this story, I realized I was documenting something that shouldn't exist. If you also believe animals carry their own testimony, subscribe to the channel. Real stories like this need witnesses. 3 weeks passed. The tracking collar transmitted data every 6 hours: location, movement patterns, activity levels. Dr. Rodriguez called me weekly with updates that grew increasingly excited. "She's ranging normally," he told me on the 3rd week, covering 4 to 5 miles per day. "The 3-legged gait seems fully adapted. Elena, she's hunting successfully. We can tell from the movement patterns, pursuit behavior, rest periods consistent with feeding. She's surviving." I felt a knot in my chest loosen that I hadn't known was there. "That's good, that's really good. More than good. This is unprecedented data for post-amputation wildlife survival." I went about my normal routines: clinic appointments, surgeries, the rhythms of rural veterinary practice. But part of my mind stayed with that coyote, tracking her invisible path through the wilderness, wondering if she remembered the strange interlude of kennels and surgical lights and the human who'd taken her leg to save her life. Then on a Thursday morning, I found the rabbit. It was lying on my back porch, precisely centered on the welcome mat. Fresh kill, still warm, neck cleanly broken in the way canids hunt. No scavenging damage, no signs it had been dropped accidentally or abandoned. It had been placed there, deliberately. I stood staring at it, my coffee mug forgotten in my hand. My property was fenced, not impenetrably. Wildlife moved through all the time, but enough that nothing was casually wandering onto my porch. And this rabbit wasn't near the porch. It was on the porch, on the mat. The same mat where a coyote had lain bleeding 3 weeks earlier. My heart dropped. I checked the tracking data on my phone. The GPS showed the coyote had been within a half-mile of my property last night between 2 and 4 a.m., well outside her normal ranging pattern, which centered 15 miles northeast. Coincidence? I told myself. Had to be coincidence. 3 days later, another rabbit. Same location, same precise placement. I called Dr. Rodriguez. "The collar data," I said without preamble. "Can you see detailed movement patterns, timestamps?" "Of course. Why? Can you tell me where she was 2 nights ago between midnight and dawn?" Keys clicking, a pause. "She moved southwest out of her normal range. Traveled about—" "Jesus! Eleanor, she came within 200 yards of your property. What's going on?" I told him about the rabbits. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Dr. Rodriguez? That's not possible." His voice had gone very quiet. "Coyotes don't do that. They don't travel outside their territory to deliver food to specific locations. That's not documented behavior. But she did it. Send me photos, document everything. I need to see this." The rabbits kept coming 5 times over the next 2 weeks, each one placed with the same care, the same precision, and each time the tracking data showed her traveling miles outside her normal range, specifically to reach my property, specifically during pre-dawn hours when I wouldn't see her approach. She was being deliberate, intentional, avoiding detection while ensuring I found what she left. Dr. Rodriguez called me on the 6th rabbit, his voice shaking. "Elena, I've consulted with 3 wildlife behaviorists, shown them the tracking data overlaid with the timeline of the kills. They all agree on something that makes no scientific sense." "What?" "She's compensating. This is reciprocal behavior. God, I can barely say this out loud. She's paying you back." I watched that footage 17 times. Each time my heart dropped further. This doesn't happen, this can't happen, but I was watching it happen. I set up a wildlife camera facing the porch. 2 nights later, it captured her. The footage showed her approaching slowly, a rabbit in her jaws. Her 3-legged gait was smooth now, practiced, economical. She climbed the porch steps carefully, 1, 2, 3, placed the rabbit on the mat. Then she adjusted its position with her nose, moving it slightly left, then forward, as if the exact placement mattered, and then she sat down. For 4 minutes and 37 seconds, she sat on my porch facing the door, waiting, watching, as if she expected me to emerge, as if she wanted me to witness this moment, to see what she was doing, to understand. When I didn't appear, she finally stood, looked at the door one last time, and descended the steps. Before disappearing into the darkness, she glanced back. Once. The camera caught her profile, the reflection of her eyes in the infrared light. Then she was gone. I played that footage over and over until I had every frame memorized. The care in her movements, the deliberation, the waiting. This wasn't instinct. This wasn't random scavenging behavior or territorial marking. This was intention, understanding, gratitude expressed in the only currency she had. The biologist's words kept echoing, "She's paying you back." But it was more than that. She was showing me she survived. She was proving someone should have believed in her all along. She was demonstrating that the witness I'd provided mattered, that documentation, testimony, seeing had value she recognized. An animal I'd cut open, whose leg I'd amputated, who should have every reason to avoid humans for the rest of her life. That animal was traveling miles through darkness to bring me food, to show me she could hunt, to prove the choice I'd made was right, to say in the language of wild things, "I remember what you did, I remember you saw me." The last rabbit appeared on a Tuesday morning in early December. I knew immediately it was the last because something felt different, final. The placement was perfect, centered exactly on the mat as always, but there was a quality to the moment that made my chest tighten. I checked the tracking data. The collar signal had vanished. I called Dr. Rodriguez, my hands shaking. "The collar, it's offline." "Let me check." Keys clicking, a long pause. "Battery died at 4:17 this morning, exactly 3 months from installation date." He exhaled slowly. "Eleanor, she made it. Full 3-month monitoring period. She survived." She'd survived against protocol recommendations, against statistical odds, against every assumption about what a 3-legged wild coyote could endure. And she'd marked the end of our agreement, the end of monitoring, the end of witness, with one final offering. 6 months later, a package arrived from the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish. Inside was a bound report, official letterhead, the weight of bureaucracy made physical. The investigation into second chance wildlife rehabilitation had concluded. The founder was charged with 43 counts of animal cruelty and unlicensed medical experimentation. The report detailed everything: the surgeries performed without proper protocols, the animals released without adequate recovery, the survival studies that were really just abandonment dressed in scientific language. My x-rays were cited 14 times. My surgical documentation became evidence in 6 separate charges. The pins I'd removed, those gleaming pieces of testimony, were photographed and catalogued as Exhibit 7C, but it was page 27 that made my hands shake. The report included necropsy findings from 7 coyotes recovered in New Mexico over 18 months. All carried surgical hardware. All showed similar pin configurations. All died from complications, infections, hardware failures, injuries to compromised bones. And then one paragraph near the bottom, one known survivor documented by Dr. Elena Vasquez, veterinarian, South Central, New Mexico. Subject survived 8 to 10 months post-initial surgery, developed secondary fracture, underwent amputation, and was successfully released. 3-month tracking period showed normal ranging and hunting behavior. Subject is believed to still be surviving as of this report. One known survivor, she was a footnote in an official investigation, a statistic that proved the others weren't inevitable casualties. That survival had been possible all along if anyone had cared enough to provide proper treatment, adequate recovery, real follow-up. She was proof that someone should have believed in them. I keep the old surgical pins in my office now, in a glass specimen jar on my desk. Not as a trophy, as testimony. I labelled it simply, Borrowed Bones, Evidence, 2024. When clients ask about it, I tell them it's a reminder. A reminder that healing isn't always about fixing what's broken. Sometimes it's about bearing witness to what's been done. And sometimes, late in the evening, when the desert light turns gold, I see her. A three-legged coyote on the ridge above my property, silhouetted against the sunset. She sits there watching my house. I can't confirm it's her. The distance is too great, the light too uncertain. But the posture is right. That patient stillness, that deliberate positioning where she knows I might see her. It's happened 11 times in 8 months. Each time I step onto my porch. I don't call out or approach. I just stand there, letting her see that I see her, that I'm still witnessing, still remembering. And after a few minutes, she stands and disappears over the ridge, moving with that economical, three-legged gait that shouldn't work but does. I still question what happened. I'm a scientist. I deal in measurable outcomes, replicable results. But those rabbits appeared. That eye contact happened. That animal made choices no wildlife behavior textbook can explain. Sometimes I pull up the security footage, watching her place those kills with such care, watching her sit and wait, as if hoping I'd emerge to witness the gift. And I cry. Not from sadness, from awe, from the stunning recognition that I'd underestimated an entire species. She survived someone's experiment, traveled miles on shattered bones, found the one person who would document what had been done. Then she paid me back in the only currency she had, proof of her survival, delivered in darkness, placed with precision on the spot where she'd first trusted me with her broken body. I don't know if I saved her, or if she saved me from ignorance, but I know this. Animals remember. They calculate. They understand debt and gratitude in ways that don't require language or reasoning as we define it. They carry their testimony in their bones, and sometimes, impossibly, against all our assumptions about consciousness and intention, they find ways to make us see it. If you believe animals remember kindness and cruelty, write, they carry their testimony in their bones in the comments below. Elena still practices veterinary medicine in New Mexico. She never removes the specimen jar from her desk. When clients ask about it, she tells them it's a reminder. A reminder that healing isn't always about fixing what's broken. Sometimes it's about bearing witness to what's been done. The coyote with borrowed bones taught her that. And she taught me. I wrote this story down because some truths are too important to fade, some witnesses too brave to forget, and some debts run deeper than the divide between species. That glass jar sits in her office still. The pins inside catch the afternoon light and gleam like evidence, like memory, like proof that impossible things happen when we're brave enough to see them.